Our guest for this episode is really special to both of us because, in some way, shape, or form, she has influenced us in choosing the paths that we are on today. Marijo Upshaw is really a movement leader in the social impact space, and she has worked tirelessly for over 30 years to launch and lead programs, scale her family business, and guide the next generation of impact leaders at Wayne State University's School of Social Work and School of Business. Today, she's sharing with us her story from the very beginning to where she is now, conducting research as a Ph.D. candidate to understand barriers to entrepreneurship for marginalized communities and increase awareness around trauma for business and social enterprise developers.
I am so excited to have a dear friend of mine joining us today. She is a powerhouse who has led financial services at Goodwill Industries in Wisconsin, and programs such as a consumer credit counseling agency and micro enterprise development program. Instead of stopping after her wide range of accomplishments, she kept on going in order to foster young leaders at Wayne State University by organizing an annual social entrepreneurship conference, sponsoring development courses for social entrepreneurs, and highlighting leaders through a social work startup story night. We don't want to give too much away, but all in all, this is a leader who is passionate about impact, and we have learned so much from her. We hope that this conversation gives you all the chance to do the same. I think we met about 5 years ago. I can't even believe that it's been that long ago. But I remember when I was transitioning from working full time, going into my program, I was freaking out and I started researching professors at Wayne State that did some type of work within the refugee immigrant population. And so I always tell people, like, go to the school for the professors, not just, for the school, so you can really learn and grow under someone during your time there. So I couldn't believe it, but I stumbled across this professor named Marijo Upshaw. And at the time, I believe you were on a board for a refugee organization. And so I was like, oh, I gotta talk to her. So I ended up meeting you. I had coffee. I told you about this idea I had to help refugees. And literally from there, you have been such a huge support system for me, advocate, turned mentor, colleague, friend, like someone that I go to for advice and just help overall, just huge advocate. And I always tell people, like, it's nothing like having an advocate that speaks for you when you aren't in the room. That's so powerful, to me. So can you give us more of an idea of what did it look like as a little girl, Marijo? I know you have a large family to kind of like who you are now. Was there any correlation?
Well, my mom was a social worker. And so I think that my mom had a really heavy influence on like my value system growing up about I'm very committed to individuals and groups that experience marginalization and who are disenfranchised. And so I know I can directly tie that back to my mom and her influence as a social worker and working with many populations that experience discrimination and oppression, whether it's persons with mental health issues, persons with differing physical abilities, persons who experience poverty. And so I know I got those values from my mom and also around race too. I had some really formidable things happen to me when I was young around race with persons my mom was working with. And I think it forever shaped my, experience and attitudes about racial justice. And so I always think every day, and my mom was also the real entrepreneur and she was the true entrepreneur because I started with her really early in my social work career as she started a social work staffing agency. Well, she started a larger agency. We did clinical practice and we did staffing as a piece of what we did. So she was the true entrepreneur because it was her capital, her idea, her. But working with her in this kind of fast growth startup agency certainly forever shaped my career trajectory in social work. Even though we're really entrepreneurial in social work, we have a really long history of being entrepreneurs all the way back to the settlement house movement and Jane Addams. We're not thought of as entrepreneurs. The kind of venturing that we do is not thought of as entrepreneurship. And I think that's similar for other predominantly female professions like nursing and education and the humanities. And so I had this great role model. And the other great thing about working in this fast growth business was that everything I know about entrepreneurship and business is kind of grounded in practice, in actual practice. I work and, read a lot of the research now, but having that grounding of what it's like, to be an entrepreneur, to try to secure resources, to try to figure out your operations, to experience personnel issues, and all of these things are, come from real life experience. And so I think that's really, kind of vitally important. So, but at this point in my career, it's really like giving back. It's like this new generation of entrepreneurs like yourself. And so I'm really excited. I mean, that's where I get my kind of passion now, is how can whatever I've experienced, whatever I've had an opportunity to do, how can I help move along the knowledge and the skill base of the next generation of entrepreneurs. And fortunately, like when we started our business back 30 plus years, there wasn't a field called social entrepreneurship. We were out there as social workers kind of creating something that looked a little different than the traditional commercial enterprise that was very value-based, very much a demonstration project for the field of social work about what we could do with social work products and services. And now, the world has caught up and we have this defined field of social entrepreneurship, but we were really innovating back then. It was when you were a social worker in practice, you either worked for an agency full-time or maybe you started a private practice. But all the other areas of entrepreneurship, like being an entrepreneur inside of an existing nonprofit or being a movement entrepreneur, which we have a lot of social workers who, would fall into that category, really weren't considered entrepreneurship because we didn't have this thing that we had labeled social entrepreneurship that would really describe what we were doing. So, but I really owe so much to my mom, and she's passed away now, but, every day I think about her and I think about like, what would she do in this situation? Fortunately, the profession is kind of caught up to social entrepreneurship, and my mom's been recognized as a pioneer from the National Association of Social Work for the work that she had done in terms of like developing social work entrepreneurship. So I feel good about that. But I was probably a really early entrepreneur and I didn't know it. I remember talking about early experiences. I remember one day, both my parents worked, which was kind of unusual in my age group to have a mother that worked outside of the home. I'm about ready to be 60. So I was one of the few friends whose mother worked outside of the home. And so she would leave every day. They both would leave for work, my parents. And one day I just decided I'm going to do this lemonade stand out front. So, I took out all my stuff for the lemonade. I don't even know what this lemonade tasted like because I was making it at like 6 years old, and I had my little table. I was quite the branding, person. I had my little vase with flowers in it. I had my little handmade sign. And this little town I grew up in, Kansas, the photographer for the daily city newspaper came by and snapped a shot of my lemonade stand, and I was on the front page of the newspaper the next day when my parents went to look to read the newspaper. Here I am with my lemonade stand because I'd packed it all up and took all my profits and put them in my pocket and never even told my parents I was running a business out of the front yard. So that was probably my first experience, and I still kind of save that picture when I want to be nostalgic of me with my little pigtails and my lemonade stand. So, But I know I got that kind of sense of building things from my mom. She was like a true builder. So she got bored with things really easy if she wasn't building new things. And I definitely can trace back, that to my mom. So very fortunate. The research actually shows that most entrepreneurs do have a family member, that there's a high correlation between starting something and having a family member that either ran a business or started a business. And so that's one of the things that we see in the research about entrepreneurship and business. So
I love that. Oh my goodness. Over the past, 6 months or so that we've really been having the privilege to chat with founders, we always hear that it was lemonade, candy. They started somewhere, clothing. It's always so interesting to kind of hear that origin story. Like, where did you start? I remember that my first business was called Golden Catering for the Soul. And I was selling these like chicken wraps at one of the food, like those vendor shows and things. So I don't know who's wrong with me. I just go and tell my mom, I'm like, hey, this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna go down to the Eastern market. I got this really great idea. And she's like, all right, let's go. And so we buy all this food, pack the cooler up, and I'm literally just out there selling it until like a guy stopped me. He's like, you need a vendor's license for this.
Right.
Like, this is illegal. So no, I just always love hearing that. And I admire your story so much because I feel that you are always so curious and fearless, and hearing more about just how you grew up with such a large family to things that you underwent, like getting your BSW. Can you tell us more about what that looked like for you, and why that was such a special moment, I think, in your life?
Well, I went and did all of my, the downside of having a social worker for a mom is like, hey, you're good no matter what you do. So it was never drilled into me, like, you're going to college, and then you're going to grad school. Like now with my kids, it's like, what grad school are you going to? It's not even what undergrad you're getting. And I think that's just a reality of our, where we're at in terms of our economy and being a very competitive labor market. So no, it wasn't easy getting my BSW because I already had a child, at that time. And I would go to school on, nights and weekends. I mean, fortunately, they had made it a little easier to get a BSW at that time. They had a program. I started out in community college, which was, something I still talk to students about because the value of community colleges is so great in terms of accessibility. And then, all the nights and weekends, and fortunately had some really wonderful role models as professors. I remember one night I couldn't get any daycare for my son, who was probably an elementary age. And so I dragged him to my sociology class with me. And the professor was so great because he researched carnivals, and that was one of his areas of research. And he was a magician, so he did magic tricks. And so here's my son thinking, oh, college is so cool. You get to do magic tricks, and that son now is a high-powered attorney. So I think it kind of set him on his way towards the importance of education as well. And he spent a couple years as a teacher and Teach for America as well. So I've been really fortunate that I've just had so many people along the way of my education that have been supportive and meant so much. And I try to pay that forward with other people. I think it's really important. So
I think that's awesome. And it was so awesome to hear also the story about how you were able to influence your son. And, Dom taught me so much about you before this episode, like things I didn't know, which you also mentioned, like how your mom was a social worker, and just to see like how she inspired you and then how you then also passed your influence on to your son was like really amazing to hear. So I see that entrepreneurial spirit sort of being passed down and that social worker spirit. I want to talk more about in detail about running and scaling your family startup. So we'd love for you to tell us the story of how Social Work PRN was born, the journey you went on to grow it.
Sure. Well, my mom had really piloted the project. She was a hospital social work director in the Kansas City area where I'm from. And she started out as the lone social worker of a community-based hospital that was rapidly growing. And it was there, she looked over to nursing and saw that nursing had this thing like flexible staffing where they would bring in nurses when someone was out, to work a shift, or when someone was on vacation, or when they needed to fill a position. She thought, well, that would work for social work. Why couldn't we do that for social work? And she had started as the lone social worker, and she grew a huge department. She had like 20 social workers in her department. They ran the mental health services. She staffed all the social workers for the mental health units, for the medical surgical units. She started an employee assistance program when she was there. So she was a builder. She was building. She was that example of an entrepreneur inside, a social entrepreneur inside of an existing nonprofit entity. And so it was there she started working with this kind of float staff. She developed a float staff of social workers. And it was, classically, we're trying to, in entrepreneurship and business, we're trying to fill unmet needs, try to identify what those unmet needs are and then develop a product or service that fills it. And at the time, social work is a predominantly female profession. And women have a lot of demands, on their time in terms of family demands. And so a lot of social workers wanted to be working, but they didn't want to work full time. They either wanted to be, home in the summer when their children were home, or they, needed kind of time ins and times outs. They just didn't want to be committed to a full-time position. And so here the organization had a need to bring in social workers on a flexible basis. And the workers had a need for something outside of full-time agency-based practice. And so just, it was a mutual fit there between what organizations were needing and what the profession was needing. And no one had really identified it. We were the first social work staffing agency in the country to develop out of the Kansas City area. And so she knew it would work because she had piloted it when she was at this local hospital. And it was, somewhere in her career when she knew, hey, she wasn't going to be able to grow any more social workers at the hospital, that she decided, I'm going to go out and do this on my own. I'm going to venture out and start a practice. And I'm not going to start a practice that looks like a traditional private practice, although my mom was a psychotherapist and she did private practice work. But she really valued like social work knowledge and education and skills, and thought, we can develop products for the market. So we can take our knowledge and whatever product is out there, we can kind of fill it. So we did a lot of things. We had a clinical practice. Staffing was one piece of it. We did assessments for nursing homes where people had a major mental health diagnosis and were placed in a nursing home. We did employee assistance work. So we did the counseling for a lot of large EAP programs, and we were their branch office in the Kansas City area. But the staffing piece kept growing. And so it kept growing, and here we were in Kansas City, and, social workers are mobile. So someone came in from Chicago and said, we don't have anything like this in Chicago. So we said to ourselves, well, Chicago is just like Kansas City. It's just like, 5 times bigger than Kansas City. So we can go to Chicago and do this. It was Midwestern. We understood the Midwest. And so we picked a really great social work town, because Chicago is a storied social work town with some excellent schools of social work and some social workers that have amazing skills. And so that was our second office opening outside of the Kansas City area. It was about 4 years into our development. And that's when we peeled off the social work PRN, the staffing piece, from everything else we did in clinical practice, and really started building that and developing it. So every year we would have a new office in the pipeline. So we, ended up growing into St. Louis, and then chronologically, I don't quite remember the order of the offices, but we grow into Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston, New Jersey, New York, Atlanta. Atlanta came became a really big office for us. We had some major contracts in child welfare and in school-based social work. So we just kept growing, and we had a model, that we developed. We'd hire an MSW social worker in every city that ran the office, who interviewed staff, who would go out and do a lot of educational settings about how do you use someone on a temporary basis. And we just kept filling a market need. And, that organization has been in business now for 30 plus years, which is kind of unheard of, in the high failure rate of businesses. We've employed thousands of social workers, over the years, and we've had some amazing staff, that have been with us almost from the start. So feels really good to be a job creator, for social workers and to fill a need. And social workers were also desperate to have something like of their own. We're so misunderstood as a profession. Like, very few people understand what we do, that we're the largest mental health profession in the country, that we deliver more clinical services than any other profession. Most people think it's psychiatry or psychology, but it's really clinical social work. So we also filled these unmet needs for affiliation and supervision and like promoting the profession. And so it was much more than a staffing agency. It was really about, again, this demonstration project for the field. And it was amazing. Loved working in it. Worked in it nearly 20 years, before I went back and started doing some other things in the field. So really fortunate experience. And again, just kind of set me for where I'm at today in terms of my research interest around entrepreneurship, particularly women's entrepreneurship and that area, and social work entrepreneurship. So
I wanted to ask you more about scaling and what it was about, I guess, the strategies that you employed as a leader to scale into all of those cities, and if there are any main takeaways that you can share with people who are trying to scale into multiple cities, or even thinking about like going out of the country. Like, what were those key takeaways and strategies that you employed?
Yeah, well, a couple. Let me talk a little bit about challenges first, and then I'll move to scale, because I think you really have to have your model down before you decide to scale. It's interesting. I just lectured on scaling last night around social impact scaling, and when to do it and what the challenges could be. And there's a little pushback about scale right now too. So I know it's one of the things we think a lot about in business, but there's some pushback to it, particularly around social entrepreneurship, around more place-based and scaling. Are we scaling just to grow? Or are we scaling and keeping that impact, front and center? So, but a few of the struggles before I first talk about scaling, and I will talk about it in our own experience. But one of the struggles we had was around like legitimacy. There's a theory in organizational practice around, it's the theory of institutionalism. And the theory kind of goes that there's certain institutional norms and practices and procedures. And the more you as an organization mimic those institutional norms, the more accepted you are. So no one in the field of social work knew what we were doing. So it was really hard in the beginning. Like, we had to do so much education because, social workers work for agencies or they work for private practice, but no one was doing what we did. And there's really some pushback, when you're doing something brand new. People, can't figure out what you're doing. They get a little nervous about what you're doing. And so that was one of the huge barriers. I mean, now looking back, I can almost be nostalgic, but it wasn't fun at the time, to feel like you're an outlier in your own profession that you love so much, and people are, almost critical. Like, you had to do so. It's interesting because the social workers were never critical, like the people who wanted this, the availability to do it. But our major institutions were very critical. And I feel like any of us that are innovating run up against that. We run up against these institutional barriers, and people don't quite understand the innovation that we're doing. And it's an uncomfortable place to be, but you got to kind of push through it. And, your North Star is that you're passionate as an entrepreneur about what you're doing does have an impact, it has a significant impact, and that you're adding value. So you got to kind of stick to that. But that was a barrier. The other barrier, because we were innovating and doing something different, whenever you're developing a new product or service, you can't rely on existing market research and knowledge. You got to kind of go out there and test things and pioneer, and then, take that data and then build a model from it. So that was a little challenging. And the whole issue about adoption of a product or service was challenging because no one had really used social workers on a temporary basis before. So that just means you have to do a lot more. I mean, if I was talking like a commercial entrepreneur, I would say marketing. If I'm talking like a social worker, I would say we need to do a lot more education and awareness. Like, how do you use? When are the opportunities you use? And so it's a lot more labor intensive than when you know that there's a known market for something. And so I think this is always a challenge of those innovators that are out there innovating. And then the third issue that directly relates to scaling. So those were all about building our model, testing our model, making sure our model worked before we started replicating in other areas, because that was our strategy about scaling, is like take your proven model and replicate in another branch location, right? In another geographical area. There's other ways to scale, but at that time, that was our model. But capital, a lot of us experience, barriers to capital, and that becomes the big barrier around scaling. And we definitely experience that, despite all the emphasis that a lot of research and even when you are an MBA program places on venture capital, that's not how most entrepreneurs, find funding and grow. They find it through borrowing, after they've, have a proven model where they've got a track record. It's really through, borrowing. And so we did not have the right relationship with a bank. And that's one thing I would encourage all new entrepreneurs, is to start developing those relationships with financial institutions that understand what they're doing. Because you don't want to, try to develop your relationship with a bank when you need money. You want to develop it, ongoing. And we were with a bank, very big bank in our area, but they understood manufacturing. They really didn't understand service-based businesses. And we definitely experienced discrimination as being a woman-owned business. Like, they kind of prayed out all the women, to you, but to be your direct liaison. But none of those women were in decision-making power. None of them had decision-making power over our loan process. And they had so over-collateralized, like I think at one point my parents had their house up, as collateral, which they really didn't need to do. We had a track record. We had, a large pool of accounts receivable that could have been collateral. So they had totally over-collateralized us. And we, ended up, we got smart, and just said, this is not the bank for us. And we went and found another bank that understood service, that had women in, major decision-making roles about the loans. And they're still at the bank, that Social Work PRN still uses today. And so that's a word of advice, like really shop around. Women and persons of color definitely experience discrimination in terms of raising capital and particularly borrowing. But they also a lot of it in venture capital as well. So women are funded much less than men are. And there's a lot of research to support this. And so I think you have to really be savvy and, go around, develop your relationship, and make sure you're getting your needs met, and unfortunately, structurally there is sexism and there is racism. And so individuals, we're trying to deal with that at the structural level, but in the interim, individuals have to learn to advocate for themselves and to kind of push past. There's some research that Black Americans who are business owners won't even go in and ask for a loan for fear that they're going to be denied. So based on, historical racism around, funding all the way back to redlining and home ownership. And so these are, kinds of things we need to do a lot more education and awareness. We need to break down the barriers, and people, really need to be able to advocate. So critically important. So after we overcome all those things, scaling was really about this model around replicating. So we had a proven formula. We knew exactly how much revenue we need to bring in for an office, to break even, and, what our staffing pattern would look like, what you do when you go into a market, classic for social work. It's like you do a needs assessment. figure out geographically what looks like a good market. So good markets for us were, some market of some size, a market that had strong schools of social work, because it was really important to have access to the potential talent pool that we would be recruiting from. So strong schools of social work were really important. Strong licensure was important because that tended to correlate with higher salaries. So it was really challenging in markets where salaries weren't good for social workers, because we always would go in and try to understand what the salary base looked like to establish our own salaries across fields of practice. So, we just developed a formula. We developed our operation model, and then we would replicate it. And that's the way that we scaled. We weren't always successful. LA was a huge bomb for us, second largest city in the country, huge bomb for us for a variety of reasons. And so, but you learn from those failures too. And I think that's something that we don't embrace enough in the nonprofit world, that we do embrace in the for-profit world, is like learning from failures, and that everyone's got their failure story. And so I was just talking to my class last night about that I wish the reason we don't see big, bold moves in the nonprofit world is it's so discouraged to fail. Whereas in the for-profit world, we're almost celebrated for failing, if we can pick ourselves up and figure out, how to take those failures and learn from them. So.
No, that's absolutely true. We had a whole series that was talking about failing forward when we kind of started this whole concept of having discussions with other founders, and that was back in the beginning of 2021. But I think, that there is a huge distinction between like how failure is encouraged in one area and it's not in the other. And I don't know if we talked to any actually leaders of nonprofits. Like obviously Dominique was one of the co-hosts, and so she like had the expertise in that area whenever we would have a discussion. But that's, I think, a really important thing to mention is, and hopefully the conversation changes around that.
Yeah, there's a great book called Uncharitable, and it's one of the thought leaders that criticizes some of our rationalized myths in the nonprofit world that really need to be debunked if we're ever going to get at solving some of the social problems that exist. And so I think it's really important. I mean, that's what I try to do in the classroom is break down what some of these challenges are.
Yeah, I actually was going to ask you. I think you are a really great example of creating a way when there is no way. I mean, and I've seen that being a professor, we had to pivot with projects to going into the social entrepreneurship committee, how we literally make something out of nothing. And you are a phenomenal strategist. You lead the way in that. So I wanted you to talk about your experience at Goodwill, how you transitioned from the PRN role then to creating a role essentially that wasn't there, right, at Goodwill. So what did that look like? Because I think that's so encouraging for social workers who are very multidimensional, but I think we lack confidence to create the things that we want compared to other traditional business sectors. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you asked me that question, because I have a big value about when there's not a job, you should create a job, whether you're doing that as an entrepreneur or whether you're doing it inside existing organizations. And so not just being reactive, but being proactive with how to use your knowledge and your skill set. So I've traveled, I've lived all across the country because I have a spouse who needed to be in different places to train for his career. So I've always been kind of scrappy about how do you reinvent yourself in different markets? And so I ended up in a smaller market in Wisconsin. It was one of the best experiences I ever had. And so what I did is I was transitioning. I had a BSW and I had an MBA. I just finished my MBA program, or was close to finishing my MBA program, and I'm in this new market. And I had always worked around nonprofits, but I had never worked for a nonprofit. So I thought, well, I know I need to be with an organization that's innovative. I just know that about me. I'm not going to work well in a bureaucratic structure. And so what I did was when I got to town, I just started interviewing. I asked people to go out to coffee. I asked a philanthropist in town, like who they saw as the five most innovative people, that were either running nonprofits or running foundations or, something around the continuum around the nonprofit world or philanthropy. So I got a list, from some storied philanthropists that I really trusted their judgment. They were innovative people. And I just started, inviting people to coffee and asking them to talk about what they did and kind of sharing my story. And so one of the folks I met was Bob Peterson, the CEO of Goodwill Industries of North Central Wisconsin. And Bob is one of these people that if you're just blessed to meet in your lifetime, like he's a cross between, he was so successful at Goodwill when he started at this Goodwill. So Goodwill is a really large nonprofit. Goodwill Industries International is a $6 billion a year nonprofit. It's not a small, and we're talking about less than 1% of nonprofits that, ever scale even over the, like the 50 million mark. And so 6 billion is huge. And so Bob took over this Goodwill, which we were a Goodwill that had a 25 county area. So across the Goodwill system, there's all these, they scale through a network model. So there's all these independent 501c3 Goodwills, but they all bubble up into Goodwill International. So the Goodwill that I was at served a 25 county area and a really small market in Wisconsin, large territory, but very small market in terms of size, no great urban size over about 150,000 in any of those areas. And we were one of the top 5 Goodwills in the country. I mean, competing against really large markets. And I attribute all of this, to Bob's vision about started there when it was like a $5 million operation and grew it into a $60 million operation. And we, continually would be the leaders in these categories. So when I first met Bob, I was just so intrigued by him. One of the things I was intrigued by is they had been very transparent with a scandal that they had, a financial scandal that they had, where one of their accountants had been embezzling because she had a gambling problem. And instead of hiding it as an organization, they made it very transparent. They actually wrote, was one of the first things I read on their website, was this account of, how it affected them culturally as an organization. And I thought, any kind of leadership that can withstand such a visible scandal, because right at the time they were dealing with this scandal, they were trying to sell back office support to other nonprofits. So we call it fiscal sponsorship, but at the time it was like hit at a really bad time. So a lot of organizations probably couldn't resist the temptation to hide it, which they could have hidden it, but instead they learned from it. They're very much a learning organization. So their cultural values as an organization were out front and center about how do you deal with the adversity that happens in organizations. And so when I read that, I'm like, any organization that could withstand something like this and be so transparent and so holistic is an organization I want to put my name with. And so I told Bob, out of all the people I interviewed, it's like, what can I do? So they had a group of community folks who had started a reentry program for returning citizens who were coming back from prison and reintegrating in their communities. And they were a great group of community professionals, but they were trying to figure out what their resource development looked like. So I just volunteered to do some grant writing for them and some resource development work. And that was my entry in as a volunteer. And from my experience working on that, Bob's like, we're going to create this new position for you to match your skill set. Like we are trying to grow out our programs around asset building for persons who have low income. And they had several programs under their portfolio and wanted to grow some more programs. And so I was hired on as their first leader of financial services, which were managing the portfolio programs. We had a consumer credit counseling program I was CEO of. We had a large tax site. We did 2,000 tax returns for persons with low income, low to moderate income. And that program is really huge in terms of the earned income tax credit is the most successful anti-poverty program in the country. We don't think about taxes lifting people out of poverty, but it's by far the most successful program. So running that program and growing that program was a real, I loved it. It was amazing work to do. And then I started a micro enterprise development program to help persons who, were starting very small businesses who needed business development and technical assistance and access to capital. So just got to do a lot of great things under Goodwill. And what amazing social enterprise. Like we talk about the field of social entrepreneurship now. It's about 30 years old, but Goodwill's been doing this for over 100 years. They were the originator of how you're an enterprising nonprofit. The Goodwill that I work for, we're about a $60 million Goodwill. So again, in the top 1% of all nonprofits in the country. And almost all of that revenue, we did a lot of workforce development. We did get some, grants and things for that, but almost a large percent of the revenue came from earned revenue from our retail operations. And I learned so much about retail because we had experts in retail. And it was just great to have that kind of capacity and be around that energy of folks that were, leading in their fields. So, so that was an example. But I often talk to people, put your skill set out there, volunteer, do something, and let people, because despite all of the social networking and the big, job site places, people still get their jobs through kind of good old fashioned networking, social networking. And so I think it's one way to kind of get your foot in the door with folks, and show your skill set as a volunteer. So it was a great job and I loved it. And I loved, having access to the Goodwill system and just learning about the Goodwill system and amazing, kind of experience. So
with these previous experiences, you've put your MBA and your MSW to work, and then you kind of came over to Wayne. And you've launched and led various programs there too. And we've worked together on some of those programs that have involved a lot of students, pitching themselves and ventures or products that they've been working on. So I wanted to ask you, over your entire career span, you've obviously had lots of interactions where you've had to put yourself out there, like you were saying, and really pitch yourself. So before we dive into the programs that you've worked on at Wayne, I wanted to put you on the spot for a second and hopefully teach our listeners a little something about how to do a quick elevator pitch of yourself. So if you want to give us your elevator pitch and imagine we're just meeting you for the first time, and then walk us through the key components of how you would go about that for someone you're trying to build a relationship with.
Yeah. So, parts of my elevator speech would be always important to introduce yourself. So, hi, I'm Marijo Upshaw. My social work identity is huge. And so I usually, introduce myself as a social worker and then talk about what I'm passionate about. I'm really passionate about trying to help entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs in particular, who experience barriers, and who are trying to solve problems. And so that's, my reason for my purpose, my reason for existing. And then, always have an ask, so the ask would be different, according to where I'm at. The ask might be, we need you to partner with us on this for this event. We need you, to show up as a mentor. We need you to have access to your distribution system so we can get some information out. So always thinking about your audience and what that ask is going to be. So, those are the basic elements. Make sure that you say your name. A lot of people even forget to say their name when they're pitching. Share something about what's motivating you. Usually I would talk about a problem too. That's a good way to pitch, is start with what the problem and then what your solution is. And then make sure you get that ask in at the end. And so I would have a lot of different pitches according to what am I pitching, to try to bring some more resources to the work that we do. We're pretty scrappy at our social entrepreneurship committee at Wayne State. We do an awful lot of work with very little, resources. And so versus if I was pitching for something else. Dominique's really the person who's great at training on pitching. So all of my students, I say, hey, if you want to learn to pitch, like a formal pitch deck, go to Dominique. She's got the technology down. So we've been fortunate to bring you in to teach other students how to pitch, because you had a lot of success, I think, in learning how to pitch, through some of the competitions that you belong to. Recognizing that pitching's a really scary thing. We just did our first Wayne State Soup, which is a micro crowdfunding platform for kind of an entry level, like how to get on the entry level ramp around a creative idea that started in the community here in Detroit and now is run by the Build Institute, a incubator program that offers business development classes, technical assistance, and access to capital. And I give it out, really give it up to folks who get up and pitch, because a lot of us have creative ideas, but to kind of put ourselves on center stage is an extremely difficult thing to do. And so I just always think that, it's about trying to create that impact. So I'm not trying to, further myself in any kind of way. So it feels a little bit more natural in terms of having that really strong foundation around advocacy and social work. So advocacy and pitching feel very similar to me. So like reframing it in a social advocacy space feels very similar to me. But I think it's really important to know what you want, like, before you go into any kind of a venue, or before you go talk with someone on a call, to kind of figure out, what is it that I want to get out of this conversation, or who is it that I want to meet. Those things are important, to be a little bit more purposeful with your networking behavior.
Yeah, having that ask is definitely so important. I think when we've run programs or workshops for like undergraduate students, that's definitely something we've placed an emphasis on, because a lot of people will go in there and they'll land a meeting with someone who they've really been meaning to talk to, but then at the end of it, it's like you could either leave with like another connection to someone else that they can give you access to, or like another resource, or you can just leave the meeting and then that's it, and you hopefully have another conversation with them. So that's definitely so important. In terms of networking, obviously you've done a lot at the school to put together an annual conference, so would love to have you talk more about that. I have been to one myself. Dominique is super involved in organizing those with you. So yeah, would love for you to share more about that, because they are awesome.
Yeah, so we formed a social entrepreneurship committee at the School of Social Work. So the work really comes from the committee, and we're been a dedicated group of folks. Dominique has been there from the almost the start of the committee, as soon as you came on as a student, and continues to work on that committee. But what we were recognizing was it's really important to create a space where people can come together, because social entrepreneurship is growing and more identifiable, but a lot of people come into it not knowing, oh, I'm actually a social entrepreneur, what I'm doing fits that. And so we wanted to create a space really for practitioners, would-be social entrepreneurs and existing social entrepreneurs, to share best practices, share ideas, share challenges. And our conference is heavily shaped by like social justice and equity issues. And so we try to look at an area and, invite folks who are really working on transformative change in communities. And so we view social entrepreneurship, there is no one standard definition, but my view of it is it includes both social enterprise and social innovation. So we also want to recognize all of those enterprising nonprofits who, have been very innovative and been very entrepreneurial, but often don't also get invited to the table. So it's really important for us to have a broad cross-section of entities represented. It's a practice conference, so we try to hit on some kind of nuts and bolts of of business planning, for any would-be entrepreneur, social entrepreneur. So things around access to financing, what financing looks like, what are the different ways you can finance an operation, and access to it, operations, inviting people in to talk about operations. Big emphasis on impact, like how do you measure impact? How do you tell your impact story? Because that's a really important piece in the work that we do. We're not just looking at our bottom line, in terms of our financial sustainability, but how effective are you as a social enterprise in solving a problem? And so to do that, you have to understand how to measure effectiveness and impact in general. And then you've got to be able to tell your impact story in different ways. And then, just inviting different folks in that are working really at many of them at the very grassroots level of what they're doing. So we've started thinking about different themes. This year, we'll be working on the theme of the intersection of food and social entrepreneurship. And so big emphasis on food justice, food sovereignty, inviting many of the food entrepreneurs in from the Metro Detroit area to talk about what they're doing. This seems to be a big sector for us in terms of growth and enterprise. And we know how hard COVID hit the food businesses. And so whether it's, labor in the food industry, or whether it's restaurants, or whether it's organizations that are using food to encourage youth entrepreneurship, we just want to invite a lot of different folks to the table to talk about it. So it's been one of the kind of highlights of, and we've gotten some really great feedback from our network partners, whether it's the law school or the business school, about how people make connections at that. So it's probably about half students and half, community professionals that come, or folks who are interested. And I think it gives people that little nudge to think I can go further in my journey, as a social entrepreneur. And so really kind of critically important to us. And we're just fortunate to be able to continue kind of planning that and sponsoring it. I'm sad because over the last 2 years in COVID, we haven't been able to do anything. We've done some smaller events online, which have been great, but nothing can kind of replicate that in-person experience and those kind of organic relationships that develop when you get a lot of people in a space that have similar interests. So it's magical. So yeah, so either December 2nd, I think, or the 9th, we'll be doing our next conference. And it'll be at the business school's always been a great partner at Wayne State and provided space for us. And the law school's a great partner, and their student clinic comes in and talks about entity formation. One of the most important things you can think about as an entrepreneur, particularly as a social entrepreneur, because we have a lot of different ways that you can form. And so thinking about, your organizational structure and your governance is a big one. So we always make sure that we cover that.
One of the things I love most about the conference is that we've really worked hard to create partnerships with other micro development enterprises like Build Institute. So you can join us on the conference, hear these phenomenal speakers, but actually feel like you're coming out of the conference with tangible things that you could do, right? And take steps. Like, for example, MJ has really been a catalyst for social entrepreneurship at Wayne State. So with that partnership, our attendees have the opportunity to then go into Build Social Impact, which is an 8-week course that provides our attendees or other aspiring or established entrepreneurs with tools, resources, and support community to develop your business plan, to understand a needs assessment or customer discovery, right? And really dive deep into your social venture idea. And it's uniquely tailored for the social worker. So we're using terms that make sense. And we're also providing those individuals with expanding, I think, their perspective just on social work, because they've been doing a lot of these financial elements in business, acumen. They just didn't have that word, right, to translate it over into the business world. So That's what I love most about the conference, that I could say, where I've been to certain things before in the past, whether it be conferences or workshops, and I'm like, okay, I'm excited about this, but what are my next steps? So, yeah, and I think through that time too, I've also learned about myself that I am a builder. I enjoy being in the grunt work of things and that hustle and bustle and figuring out what that looks like. Um, and MJ has really helped me always understand just to be more intentional before I make moves and to understand what's the strategy behind it. Um, Often as visionaries, when you're a founder, right, you are someone who has huge ideas, but oftentimes you're not sure how it's going to work. So taking the time to really be strategic about how your next step should be ordered, I think is really huge. So now I apply that same mindset when I join an organization and volunteer my time, or when I'm thinking of making a business decision. So that's been huge. And MJ, I want to know, how do you have a strategy behind how you go from having an idea to the planning and the execution part? Like, do you already have this like rhythm, or how do you approach that mindset? Because I think that's so good.
Yeah, strategy was one of I got an award in my MBA program for for strategy from the Wall Street Journal. So uh, it's just one of those things I really like. I think it goes back to my social work education around thinking about the individual or the organization and the environment. So I'm always like scanning my environment for what's going on. And another kind of core thing around fit, just thinking what the strategic fit is. So those are the two things I'm constantly assessing. Like, I'm looking, I'm taking in information, I'm assessing all the time. And we try to teach folks how to do that, like scanning their environment and thinking about, some things are just can be technologically taught, like thinking about the industry that you're in. It's one of the things I, still rely on, like Michael Porter's work around 5 forces in industry analysis, because I work with a lot of students that have good ideas, but this is a common phenomenon I see, that students come in with an idea without understanding the competition at all. Has anyone done this? Is anyone doing this? And so having them do some sort of like, we don't like the word competition in the nonprofit, so I might call it a comparative analysis instead of a competitive analysis, but it's the same technology. Like, who else is out there doing what you're doing? According to customers, your target beneficiaries, what are the most important features or benefits of your product or service that they would say are the most important? And then like rate yourself on what your offering is compared to other places. Think about the industry you're in, and it's a shock to a lot of social workers that they're in an industry, but meds and eds are driving our education, our economy right now. And so they are the new economy. And so you are in an industry, whether you want to recognize it or not. So you might want to understand how the industry works. Is it growing? Is it flat? What are the barriers to entry in the industry? What's the rivalry look like with the competition? What are some of the issues around suppliers? Like, recently supply chain has really slowed down, so much of our economy just based on some of the challenges with the COVID crisis. Where's the power lie? Is it with suppliers? Is it in the rivalry? Is it with purchasers? What are kind of the threats or substitutes? Kind of classic Porter's analysis of industry. And I think it's really important to do. So all that, and then just having a strategic, like, what is your strategy? Are you going to be, when you're working around social entrepreneurship, one of the strategies that we're starting to see in practice is that you have to really have a competitive, niche. You have to be filling something that no one else is filling. And particularly because you're working in areas where markets have failed, where there isn't a profitable way to design a business, because the market would already do it. The for-profit area would already do it if it was. So you have to really think about operating in that space where you're offering something so specialized that you can push up your prices and, do things like that. We see a lot of what I call social staffing. These are social enterprises that are working on, they might develop a particular product or service, but the real product or service is helping people who experience marginalization in the labor force find living wage employment and, and stay in that employment. And so to do that, you've really got to be creating something special because you got to push up your prices. So just thinking competitively, like this is where I think business, adopting business principles and understanding business principles and applying them to the social sector is like really critically important. And I don't know, maybe it's, being the youngest of 6 and figuring out how I was going to get the food ran out at the end of the month. So maybe that's where I get my strategy from. I don't know, but there's just something there that I really like. So
no, I love that. Yeah, you have to be relentless, right? You have to figure it out.
Yeah. I mean, I never went without food. I want to say that.
No,
but good food was gone really early on.
Her parents always made sure she had food. I'm just joking, guys.
Yeah.
No, I love that. Another thing too that I think during this process of social entrepreneurship is that many of the things you just mentioned is rooted in social impact value and how to show that. And because traditionally in for-profit, you equate your success and impact value through what profit sales, right? So, or your profit margins. So I love that you touched on that. And earlier you mentioned, actually, I made a note of it, but you spoke about how many social workers like you guys were able to hire, as well as the staffing agencies you all set up. So that's part of your social impact value. So if our listeners are just unsure of what that would look like, it would be that, hey, this is the work we put in, that was our input, our output was X, Y, and Z, X amount of people have been hired. We have staffing agencies across the country, and then also we've generated X, in revenue or so. So I love you spoke about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's much easier in the for-profit world. We have clear indicators, of well-established, general accounting principles and clear indicators of financial success. We don't have that in the nonprofit world. We're trying to develop it, but we don't have it. And so thinking about what your impact story is, and I find this a challenge for a lot of students. They have a creative idea, but I don't know what problem they're trying to solve. So I really try to push people on what is the problem that you're trying to solve, which is something we do in business, really work on the needs of solving the problem. And make sure that there's a match between, I want people to stay a little solution agnostic when they're trying to develop, like in the classroom, a business venture, a social venture. It's like focus in on the problem, really understand the problem. There's a lot of different solutions for problems, but thinking of a creative solution, but it has to match the problem versus, trying to come up with a solution first and then match your solution you're very wedded to a problem maybe you don't understand that well. And so I think that putting the problem first, really diving in, understanding the problem from the people who experience it, that's so important. You can get a lot out of the research literature, secondary analysis, but doing some primary research on, with folks that experience the problem is really kind of critical. So I think that is very important. And then, job creation has been one of those big things around social impact but we've got to dig a little deeper. It can't just be any job. It has to be, a sustainable job. We can't just accept that job creation alone is an adequate impact measure, because we know that jobs have to, sustain individuals and their families. And so we've got to dig a little deeper for what those jobs look like, and also think about, are we fostering empowerment in communities, or are we extracting? So anything that's extracting, we should really stay away from in our models. We're just replicating some of the challenges with for-profit, entrepreneurship if we're, creating any kind of dependency or creating any kind of extractive wealth. And it's the work we do is so much harder, because we've got all these different stakeholders and all these different guidelines. And so I think it's extremely challenging. And if there was an easy answer, again, the market would have done it by now. So we're working in a lot of areas where markets have failed, and we're trying to create value for so many different key stakeholders. So it's extremely challenging work to do. And that's where you have to be strategic, to be successful. So yeah, I think that's one of the things that, economics teaches us, just there's an opportunity cost. So if I'm over here working on this, maybe I'm adding some value, but if I'm not really solving the problem, then it's an opportunity cost because I'm using my time and talent and resources and for something that might feel good, but probably isn't addressing the root issue, so trying to dig down to those root issues is really important. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Yep, because although it feels good, is it really like moving the needle, right?
Yeah.
So that's good. That's something that I'm working on as well, is really looking at the root cause and like how are the inputs that I'm creating delivering effective outputs? Like
Yeah.
and what's the overall North Star in that? And um as we wrap up, I wanted to just share a few points on pitching because that just reminded me of pitching. And I'm always an advocate for pitching, but it's so important that you go into the pitch having your North Star, because when you receive feedback from the pitches, what you don't want is to come out of each pitch that you have and now you're like, I don't even know what my mission is. So it's just important that you go into with a strategic mindset of, hey, this is really the goal. And perhaps that goal should be, MJ mentioning fostering, empowering communities, right? Like that's your overall end goal, right? So how are you getting there? So whatever that is for you, how you plan to foster those, foster and empower those communities, like just make sure you have that. And you're taking everything that the judges are saying or your mentors, whatever, with a grain of salt, because no one knows, right?
Oh, I think that is so important. Yeah, like one of the things you asked is like, what advice would you give to an entrepreneur? And we don't know. I mean, venture capital people don't know. Like people who are deemed as the experts miss a lot of opportunities because they don't see what the entrepreneur sees. And so I think that in some way you've got to, be able to take in input, take in people's creative ideas, but not pivot every time that you like really stick with. One of the things we know about successive entrepreneurs is they have somewhat blinders on, they're like so passionate about their idea that they're not even looking. Sometimes that could be a detriment, but sometimes you need that because people are going to pull you off. There's going to be the haters and there's going to be people that think they're helping you, but are really pulling you off. And so you have to have some sort of filter to take the information that's important, but not to, be so scattered that you can't. You're going to get information and feedback from your system. And, some of that is going to shape your direction. And you need to be open to that. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying that a lot of people that put themselves out as experts, I have a hard time like in the classroom because I have to deliver some feedback that sounds kind of negative. And, part of it just comes out like, very matter of fact. I'm probably a lot nicer than like if you pitched in front of some VC people, but I always do a caveat as I don't really know. None of us really know. So, if you believe in something and you believe in it enough to keep, putting your time and investment in it and bringing others to the table who are key stakeholders, you just have to have a filter for some of that because you are going to get, and, we have these great examples. We have these billboards all over Detroit now from the woman who started the Lip Bar, who was famously told, from the shark VC person that this is never going to work, and he had no idea that there, the market that was out there because he's not in that space, nor was he interested in understanding anything about that space. Yeah. And so there are going to be those people. And if she had all the requisite knowledge and skills, and she believed in what she was doing. And so,
Right.
and she proved everybody wrong. She proved them wrong. And so I love these billboards all over Detroit with this story, because I think it just shows, that we as the quote unquote experts, really don't know. There's some
Yeah,
things that
yeah.
are known, and there's some things we can't know. And and there's some things that people with their personal experience and their knowledge and skills can see that we don't see. And so I think and so many times, markets have been discounted because they're not the majority dominant, white market for
Yeah.
products or services. And so they get discounted. And we, I mean, that's just flat out, structural discrimination and oppression. Part of those entrepreneurs are proving that these things are wrong. And so
Yeah.
they're changing the dial on things. I love it. So
Yeah. Oh, I love those billboards
yeah.
too.
And
Yeah.
women, we have 3 entrepreneurs on this thing. We get discounted so often. I'm really interested in the research right now, just digging in ontologically about how entrepreneurship is even viewed. There's so much time and attention in the research literature about, these gazelles or unicorns or venture capital, and a lot of discounting about kind of everyday entrepreneurship, which is more the norm. And
Yeah.
a lot of kind of what are male-centered principles around entrepreneurship, very male-focused. And then we try to judge women entrepreneurs by, what we've given as to be reality, which is not reality. It's socially constructed. So I'm really interested in taking more of a feminist standpoint in my research around barriers that women face, and how to be successful around promoting women's entrepreneurship and other communities that struggle. Because I think we just accept a lot of things that if we click on that and like try to unpack what's behind that, you'll find a lot of unquestioned assumptions. And I think that's the value of research, is starting to question what some of these assumptions, have been. So that's kind of driving me now, in my later years, is to think about how do I increase my tool set to become a effective researcher in this area. So
I actually wanted to talk to you exactly about that. So just about forging new paths um and really your research and how you landed on pursuing this PhD to be your new path. One thing that, whether you realize it or not, you really helped me do while I was in your class, and I love that class so much. Like yours and David's teaching style together it made me so excited to just come in on the weekends. Even though class is on the weekends, I was like, yes, like I get to go today, and we're gonna have like this session where we're just like getting information for like a few hours straight and really learning a lot of valuable stuff about impact investing. And at that time, I was like dreading working in a traditional software engineering job after graduation. I think I was a junior when I took your class, but I was thinking about that. I'm like, oh man, I'm not sure if this is like the path I want to go down. And I remember coming to you and asking you for advice and mentioning that maybe my next step is like working for a bit and then doing a JD MBA. And within a matter of minutes, I think you asked me like, what do you think your purpose really is? And like, let that be sort of the helper in your decision making. And even though you probably didn't realize that at the time, I think that conversation really was one of the major moments when I realized, okay, this career is what I trained for, but I can apply all of that skill set to a problem that I actually really care about, and that has directly impacted me and millions of other people. So I really want to thank you for that, because I actually don't think I've told you that before. But since you've realized, okay, maybe you've been thinking about this for a while, but you realized you wanted to go back and get your PhD, I wanted to ask you if there was any single moment when you realized you wanted to go back on like one more time to school, despite what you've already done, and then if you want to talk more about your research because that is what you were discussing before, and just to know your why.
Well, thank you, because that's huge, like that I would have any impact on. And, but I think that's, what puts me in the classroom, certainly. And that's where I get my energy from, is from the creative ideas. And I think it's particularly important to support entrepreneurs that don't, one of the things we know about entrepreneurial intention from the research is that there are certain factors that can explain entrepreneurial intention with the knowledge that we have now. And the factors are like a personal favorable attitude towards entrepreneurship, which a lot of people come in, they've been that entrepreneur since they were young, or they, are driven by, I think I could do this. The other factor is perceived behavioral control. So do I feel like I have the self-efficacy? We call it entrepreneurial self-efficacy to do this. And if you're in business school, you probably are thinking, I'm here to develop my skills and, I can do this, but you might still be unsure of your skills. And so that's one area I think we can have huge influence on. And I'm really motivated by all of those persons that have creative ideas to solve, protracted social problems, but don't necessarily see themselves, as an entrepreneur. So those persons in social work and nursing and education and public health, and all the areas that happen to be very predominantly female professions, that I know that they're coming in with super creative ideas and would really benefit from the help of some more customized entrepreneurship education, really customized for them and for their learning needs. And then the other big areas is kind of subjective norms. So do people in your environment encourage you? And we know that subjective norms kind of works through these other two things: a favorable attitude towards entrepreneurship and perceived behavioral control. So in business school, you're going to be in an environment where people believe that, you can be an entrepreneur, but in a lot of other spaces, you're not going to get that, kind of rich, we call it entrepreneurial munificence. You're not going to get that rich environment that has all these learning opportunities, or that you're hearing the values that people support what you're doing. So I'm really passionate about that and really want to understand more about those areas where, a non-traditional kind of entrepreneurship paths, and how we could be greater facilitators of people's creative, innovative ideas. And what would be worse is to be in your subjective norm environment, people telling you, no, no, that's not a good idea, or no, entrepreneurship isn't valuable, or no, you can't do that because you're this or you're that, or you have no history of doing this, or no one in your family's ever done this. And so I think kind of creating that rich environment is so important. And that's really been, I wasn't sure I wanted to be a researcher. I know I love program development. I know I love building things. I know I love, leadership. I know I love teaching, but research is, a different kind of skill set, a different toolkit that I didn't necessarily have. And so fortunately at the School of Social Work, they kind of lowered the barriers to kind of jump into the Ph.D. program by having a postgraduate research and evaluation certificate. So I just tested the waters a little. So there's an example of where your environment can shape. I'm not even sure I would have ever decided to get into the Ph.D. program if the organization wouldn't have lowered the barriers by having this postgraduate certificate where I could test out, you're taking the same classes as, any PhD. Seeing is this something I really like, and when you go back in, to a program, a PhD program, particularly like later in life, but I've noticed this with a lot of my colleagues too, you're really proficient in whatever you do. A lot of my colleagues have been practitioners for a number of years, very skilled with their clinical. Some of them have expertise in certain areas in sexual health, or substance use and abuse treatment, or general clinical practice. And to put yourself back into an environment where you're learning again is an extremely difficult thing to do. And so just a big shout out to the Wayne State School of Social Work, because I feel like I'm in a learning environment that really nurtures me. And that's what I want to create for others, in particular those persons who really have creative ideas, are very entrepreneurial in the way they approach problems, but haven't necessarily had, people supporting their entrepreneurial goals, or, worse off, people questioning, can you do this? Why would you do this? It's hard. Like, being an entrepreneur is hard. Like, it's dealing with uncertainty. None of us really like uncertainty as, human beings. We're more geared towards stability, I would say, even though our world is so uncertain. And so to put yourself back in that uncertain environment is, one of those things that's extremely challenging to do. So I think having positive role models, having mentors, having people that can help guide you is again, just like critically important. So that's what my area of research I'd like to focus in on. I just have designed a study with a couple of my colleagues to look at the entrepreneurial tensions of social workers, because we know nothing about them. There has been a lot of research on entrepreneurial intentions, but nothing on this particular group. And so I want to understand, how do social workers come to entrepreneurship? What are their motivations? Where do they experience barriers? What are the facilitators, and how we could develop more customized? We have like 800 plus accredited social work schools across the country. We graduate 45,000 social workers a year. So for me, it's a huge human capital thing. If we can get more of those social workers thinking entrepreneurially about solving problems, then maybe some of these problems would actually, get solved. And so, it's that's what's guiding me kind of towards the end of my career, is how could I, add to the research that would shape more of that work around empowering folks to have the kind of knowledge, skills, and abilities to use themselves as an entrepreneur out in the world. And I think it's important because we've seen all these spikes we always see spikes in our economy and our labor. So I think, being able to feel comfortable that you can create your own job is huge, and not just feeling dependent on others to create a job for you. It's like, it's a form of empowerment. So.
And you touched on something I thought was so special. You sharing that it's really, I think a part of your why is identifying those individuals who are passionate about a cause and nurturing them. And one thing that I think you are phenomenal at is really empowering people and seeing them when at the time they may not see themselves. And I know through my own journey of entrepreneurship and shifting my mindset from being an employee and only thinking I was good at certain things, because how we equate our success and worthiness oftentimes is through the promotion or the job, what that looks like, right? And how sexy the title is. But it was often those times when I didn't see myself as adequate or worthy. And you really empowered me. And for you, I guess I see it as you seeing me as that, me not being there, and really working to push that gap to now understand, like, wow, I am worthy, I am adequate, I can do this. And I think for me, that's been such a huge push and motivation for me to really accept myself and know that I can do these things. And I think that's a huge part of your purpose that I've seen and a part of your why. And I thank you for that. And that's why I admire you so much for that, because it pushes me to always see that in others and be a part of that change, for them and pushing them towards that. So would you say that's a part of, your why? I don't know if that's something that you've seen yourself. We tell you all the time how much we love you and how much we appreciate you, but I get a bit emotional even saying that because I just appreciate you so much.
Oh, wow. That's huge. Thank you for that. I think I got that, just to go full circle, from my mom, who, my mom was like a sage. She would sit and people would just come to her and sit around her and glean whatever. And she was always so, I spent a lot of time on the road with her. A lot of these offices we opened on a budget. So we would drive everywhere. And so, we'd be in the middle of, Oklahoma or something on a fairly deserted road heading down to Texas. And I would hear these stories of her when she was young. And she was so fearless. Like, she told me a story about her tap dancing at like the little community fair. I'm like, you were a tap dancer? And she's like, no, I just like the sound that the shoes made. So she got up for the whole community and tap danced, and she never had any lessons. And I'm like, oh my God, my mom's been tap dancing her way around life. Like, she was so fearless. Like, you couldn't. So she just had this like spirit about her. And I think one of the things is, she often called me, and I got this from her, like being the honeybee. Like, I can see resources out there and I can see people, and how do you connect these things? And so I like doing that. I get a lot of gratification out of it. It means a lot to me. I think like a true test, I teach leadership is one of the classes I teach at Wayne State, social work leadership. And I think, one of the true tests of leaders is not like what you've done in your life, but how many people can you name off that you've impacted? Like, that's a real leader, that shares whatever they have with others so that they, can be successful in their journey. And so that's like my litmus test for leadership is, how many people can I, really have some sort of impact with. And so I try to remind myself of that. I don't always live up to that. And like, sometimes I have to remember it. Like, sometimes I feel like, whether you're delivering feedback, it can feel negative. That's the worst part of teaching, is the grading and stuff. It's horrible. So when I hear stories like that, it's really meaningful for me. But I get all this gratification out of what other people are doing. It just warms my heart, what other people are doing, how they're using themselves. And I think, version 2.0 of social entrepreneurship is a lot of version 1.0 of social entrepreneurship, where people coming up with creative ideas and coming into communities they didn't know that well. And, I'm glad to see kind of version 2.0 of social entrepreneurship is like, how do you promote people already within communities to solve their own problems? Back to that example that you gave when you first met me, I was working in refugee. The Syrian crisis, which is still going on, was happening. And I saw all these amazing advocates who were willing to risk their lives, like face bullets for what they believed in, human dignity. And I thought to myself, like, wow, if these people can, face bullets, like, I don't have any other choice but to be involved, like what kind of skill set do I have that I can give? And it wasn't not about me coming in, because, these Syrians, were in control of their own destiny. And so for me, it was more about like, how can I be an ally and take those resources I have and help the people, that are most impacted by something. And so, that just always sticks with me. It's not about what you do. It's like how you can, if you have resources, then you need to share those with other people. You need to be an ally to other communities that have experienced, oppression or concentrated disadvantage or those kind of areas. And so I'm glad to see the field of social entrepreneurship is kind of moving in that direction. I don't think we're there, but we need to keep moving in that direction about building real power, and power needs to be nested in the communities that are most affected by a problem. So they know the solutions. It's just like getting the resources to folks that already know what the solutions are. So for themselves, that makes sense for themselves. So that's like kind of critically important to me as well. So, but thank you for that. You make me cheerful, both of you. So
You talked about like communities, how they know themselves best, and I kind of want to take that and go into how small projects can create waves of change. And one thing I remember very vividly from the class that I took with you is the lectures and the discussions we would have about smallholder farms and how ripples of impact coming from just one individual or one family from like their plot or a few plots can strengthen like the entire economy around them on a larger scale. And then you talked about how while you were at Goodwill, you were personally involved in a lot of micro enterprise development in low income and marginalized communities. So you really understand the power of people and the power of the individual, and just of what seem to be small projects and how they can create these waves of change over time. So with that, I was hoping that you could help us wrap up by sharing what you hope the next generation of these individuals, these social impact, these social entrepreneurs can bring to the table in terms of impact, and how we can set them up for success, because you've done that for so long.
Yeah. So I do believe a lot in personal agency. I wouldn't be a social worker if I didn't think that, people had self-determination and agency to not only just react to their environment, but to enact their environment, like to shape their environment. It's critical to who I am. At the same time, people face such huge barriers. Like we've seen it over the last 2 years, with COVID, like all the existing structural barriers that exist. And so I think, people can make huge differences with the ventures that they start, but we also need to work more in collective impact. I don't think there's any one organization that can, deal with as wildly successful as like a Grameen Bank has been in microfinance, and all of the kind of sister organizations that Dr. Muhammad Yunus started at a Grameen to deal with some of the long-standing issues in Bangladesh, and then, throughout other parts of the world. Poverty is such a complex problem that it's going to take all of us working in collective impact. So I think systems entrepreneurship is something I'm really interested in terms of how do we all work together, to change systems. And we've had some really good success stories, I think, recently, like the whole reframing of human trafficking is one example that I give, that, we're no longer talking about trafficking. Human slavery is at an all-time high, and there's all different kinds of form of it, but one of them is like sex trafficking. And somebody young, it's largely something that affects women around the world, and affects a huge number of young women, like women who aren't even of majority age. And so reframing things from prostitution to trafficking on a systems level has helped change laws. We've seen it change laws here in Michigan. And when you start changing attitudes and changing perceptions and then changing laws, you get into real transformative change. And so one of the things I like to remind, entrepreneurs is, as you work on your problem, as you work on your venture, how can you be working with others, and in models of collective impact. And this is one of the things I love about training as a social worker, because unlike some other helping professions that focus more on the individual, we focus on the individual and the environment. And so as a social worker, you might be clinical in the nature of your practice, but you can't ever negate, if you start seeing a lot of folks that are experiencing a similar problem, what can you do on the advocacy level, on the legislative level, to change policy or to change your organizational policies or legal policies? And so I think it's really important that we're doing a lot more work around ecosystems and entrepreneurship building. And I think we all need to think about, our place in the ecosystem and how we can strengthen the overall ecosystem and how we can work with others. And this is where I think business is pretty good. I often think business does a better job than the nonprofit world about understanding the strength of a sector. Like, how do you increase a sector's strength? I think in the nonprofit world, we often have this mind of scarcity, that there's scarce resources. And so whereas business has a mind of, scale and expansion and what could we do with the resources? And so I think it's really behooves all of us to be working with others, to be working on our project, but to be working with others that are, changing systems. So thinking about part of your time being dedicated to advocacy and dedicated to legislative action, or, dedicated to dismantling structural oppression, whether it's sexism or racism or homophobia or all the other kind of areas of structural oppression that a person's experience. And so I think that's like kind of really critically important. And we're going to see a lot more, I think, around systems entrepreneurship. It's not just going to be the celebration of an individual entrepreneur, social entrepreneur doing something, but how are we all working together? And the nonprofit world has done a pretty good job in collective impact. And so I think we've got something to learn from them about, how do you do that? So I think that's important. We're probably going to see more funding, maybe like the nonprofit world foundations support a lot of collaborative grants to get more nonprofits working together. I think we'll see more of that as the evolution of social entrepreneurship. The other thing we don't know about social entrepreneurship, even though it's a growing field, is how well it works. Is it working any better than what we had before? So there has to be more research in the area of, are we delivering on our promises about delivering impact? And so that's an important part too. So.